We think of science as humanity's great quest for knowledge, a beacon of progress that has cured diseases, mapped the cosmos, and unlocked the very secrets of life. But what happens when that quest goes too far? What happens when the relentless pursuit of answers ignores the human cost? There's a dark side to discovery, a history written in the agony of unwilling participants and the chilling ambition of researchers who simply lost their way. From secret government programs that weaponized sex and drugs, to concentration camp doctors who twisted medicine into an instrument of torture, we're counting down the most horrifying experiments in history. These are the stories of science that crossed the line from curiosity into pure evil, leaving a legacy of pain, trauma, and crucial, hard-won lessons about the ethical lines that must never be crossed again. A word of warning. The stories you're about to hear are not for the faint of heart. 10. The Monster Study, 1939. We begin with an experiment so deceptively simple, yet so profoundly cruel, it was dubbed the Monster Study by those who knew of its existence. In 1939, at the University of Iowa, a prominent speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson wanted to prove his theory that stuttering was a learned behavior, not a biological one, caused by anxiety. His hypothesis was that labeling a fluent child a stutterer could actually create the condition. To test this, he and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, went to an orphanage in Davenport, Iowa. They chose 22 children, some who stuttered and some who didn't. They split the fluent children into two groups. One received praise for their speech. The other group, a handful of normally speaking orphans from 5 to 15 years old, were about to have their confidence systematically destroyed. Tudor began to relentlessly criticize their speech. She told them they were developing a stutter, that they had to stop themselves and that they should never speak unless they could do it right. For months, these vulnerable children were subjected to intense negative psychological pressure. They were told they had a problem that never existed, and the results were heartbreaking. The children became anxious, withdrawn, and intensely self-conscious. Some refused to speak, covering their mouths in fear. The psychological harm was immediate, and for some, lifelong. They had been deliberately traumatized in the name of science. Johnson, perhaps realizing the horror of what he'd done, never formally published the full data and actively hid the study's nature. It wasn't until decades later that the university formally apologized. Hollow comfort for the children who were taught to fear their own voice. The Monster Study is a stark lesson that research subjects are not data points, but human beings, and that the scars of psychological torment can last a lifetime. 9. Operation Midnight Climax, 1950s to 1960s. At number 9, we uncover a secret so bizarre it sounds like a twisted spy movie plot. But it was terrifyingly real. At the paranoid height of the Cold War, the CIA became obsessed with mind control. This obsession spawned the infamous MK Ultra project, and one of its most sordid sub-projects was codenamed Operation Midnight Climax. Starting in the 1950s, the CIA set up brothels, they called them safe houses, in San Francisco and New York. They hired prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men back to these apartments. The pads were decorated to look the part, with French posters and racy photos, but they hid a sinister secret: two-way mirrors and hidden microphones. Once a John was inside, he was drugged with a cocktail of substances, most notably LSD, without his knowledge or consent. From behind the mirrors, CIA agents would sit, sometimes drinking martinis, and observe the men's behavior under the influence of powerful hallucinogens. The supposed goal was to study LSD's effects and see if the combination of drugs and sex could be used to extract sensitive information, a kind of psychedelic honey trap. This wasn't a small-scale operation. It ran for nearly a decade, and the total number of civilians victimized remains unknown. The agents weren't just watching, they were taking detailed notes, treating human beings like lab rats in a sordid, government-funded peep show. The project was eventually shut down in the mid-1960s after an internal CIA audit raised alarms. Most of the records were destroyed in 1973, burying the full extent of the operation and the names of its victims. Operation Midnight Climax stands as one of the most flagrant examples of a government agency turning on its own citizens, violating their minds and bodies in a depraved quest for control. 8. Nazi bone and muscle transplantation, 1942 to 1943. The name Nazi is synonymous with unimaginable cruelty, and their so-called medical experiments represent one of the darkest chapters in the history of science. At the Ravensbrück concentration camp, a camp primarily for women, a series of barbaric experiments were conducted to study bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. The goal? Find better ways to treat German soldiers wounded on the battlefield. The method? Pure torture. Polish women were chosen as the unwilling subjects. SS doctors, including Karl Gebhardt, would inflict battlefield-style wounds on them. Without anesthesia, they would cut into the women's legs to remove sections of bone, muscle, and nerves. These tissues were then either transplanted to another victim or just removed entirely to see what would happen. To simulate battlefield infections, the doctors deliberately stuffed the wounds with dirt, glass, and virulent bacteria, like those that cause gas gangrene and tetanus. The agony was indescribable. The women suffered from extreme pain, high fevers, and horrific infections. Many died from the procedures themselves. Those who survived were left permanently mutilated, crippled for life. These experiments weren't just medically unsound, they were acts of sadistic violence disguised as research. This wasn't science, it was butchery. 7. Nazi sterilization experiments, 1941 to 1945. The Nazi obsession with racial purity fueled some of their most widespread and horrifying experiments. At camps like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, thousands of men and women became victims of a systematic program of sterilization. The goal was chillingly simple: develop a fast, cheap, and efficient method to sterilize millions of people the Third Reich deemed undesirable: Jews, Romani people, and the disabled. The methods were varied and uniformly brutal. One involved injecting a caustic chemical substance into the uteruses of women, all without anesthetic. The substance was designed to scar the fallopian tubes, causing infertility. The procedure caused agonizing pain, severe inflammation, and often led to life-threatening infections and cancer. For men, doctors like Horst Schumann pioneered sterilization through intense radiation. Prisoners were brought into a room, tricked into thinking they were just filling out forms. Unbeknownst to them, they were being blasted with massive doses of X-rays aimed at their reproductive organs. The radiation caused severe burns that were excruciatingly painful and frequently led to cancer. The practice was an assembly line of mutilation, a key part of the Nazi blueprint for genocide. It was a perversion of medical knowledge, turning the tools of healing into weapons of racial annihilation. 6. Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972. For 40 years on American soil, the United States Public Health Service conducted what is arguably the most infamous biomedical research study in U.S. history. In 1932, the study enrolled 600 poor African-American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama. 399 of them had syphilis, while 201 did not and served as a control group. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague local term for all sorts of ailments, and were offered free meals and burial insurance as incentives. It was a lie. The men were never told they had syphilis, and they were never truly treated for it. The real purpose of the study was to observe the natural, untreated progression of the disease all the way to death. For 4 decades, doctors simply watched as these men suffered. They performed painful and deceptive procedures like spinal taps, disguising them as special free treatment. The ultimate betrayal came in the 1940s, when penicillin became the standard, effective cure for syphilis. The men in the Tuskegee study were deliberately denied it. Researchers actively prevented them from getting treatment from other doctors to ensure their subjects would continue to decline. Over the decades, the men went blind, suffered mental breakdowns, heart failure, and other devastating health problems. By the time the study was exposed by the press and shut down in 1972, at least 128 men had died from syphilis or its complications. 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study left a deep and lasting wound, a legacy of medical mistrust in the African American community that persists today. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the few remaining survivors, stating, "You did nothing wrong, but you were grievously wronged." Let us know in the comments below. And if you find these explorations into the darker side of history compelling, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. 5. Nazi twin experiments, 1940s. In the hierarchy of horror that was Auschwitz, one name stands out as the face of medical evil: Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. A physician with a PhD in anthropology, Mengele saw the camp as his own personal laboratory for grotesque genetic research, and he had a particular obsessive fascination with twins. Upon arrival at the camp, twins would be singled out and placed in special barracks. They got slightly better food and were temporarily spared the gas chambers, but this was no act of mercy. It was just to keep them healthy for Mengele's experiments. He subjected roughly 1,500 pairs of twins, many of them children, to a nightmare of procedures, all performed without anesthesia. Mengele would inject diseases and chemicals into one twin to compare the reaction to the other. He transfused their blood to one another. In his insane quest to understand Aryan genetics, he would inject dye into children's eyes to try and change their color to blue, a process that was intensely painful and often caused blindness. There are even accounts of him sewing twins together to try and create artificial conjoined twins. They suffered in agony for days before dying. When one twin died, whether from an experiment or illness, Mengele would have the other twin killed with an injection to the heart. This way, he could perform comparative autopsies. Their organs were harvested and sent to research institutes in Germany. Of the roughly 3,000 twins who entered Mengele's lab, only about 200 survived. The twin experiments weren't science. They were the sadistic actions of a man who saw human beings as nothing more than specimens to be tortured and dissected for a monstrous racial ideology. 4. The Trinity Nuclear Test, 1945. Not all horrifying experiments involve direct human torture. Some are terrifying because of their sheer, world-altering potential for destruction. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, in a desolate part of the New Mexico desert known as the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death, the world was violently and permanently shoved into the atomic age. This was the Trinity test, the first ever detonation of a nuclear weapon. Scientists of the Manhattan Project gathered in bunkers miles away, many of them deeply anxious. They were about to unleash a force never before seen on Earth, and there was a terrifying, if small, theoretical possibility of disaster. A concern had been raised that the atomic explosion could be powerful enough to trigger a self-sustaining fusion reaction in the atmosphere, essentially setting the entire planet's air on fire. Although calculations had concluded this was nearly impossible, the fear remained. In the tense moments before the test, physicist Enrico Fermi was reportedly taking bets on whether the bomb would destroy just New Mexico or the whole world. When the bomb detonated, it released energy equal to 21,000 tons of TNT, vaporizing its steel tower and turning the desert sand below into a green, radioactive glass called trinitite. The flash was seen for hundreds of miles, but beyond the existential dread was a more immediate danger. The project had not warned or evacuated any of the nearby civilian populations, mostly rural Hispanic communities and Native American tribes. The radioactive fallout cloud drifted over their homes, farms, and water sources. These downwinders were unknowingly exposed to extreme levels of radiation, leading to generations of cancer, birth defects, and other illnesses. The Trinity test was a gamble with the fate of the world, and while it didn't end humanity in an instant, its radioactive legacy brought a slow, silent death to many who were in its path. 3. Nazi freezing/hypothermia experiments, 1942. Back in the chilling confines of the Dachau concentration camp, SS Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted another series of infamous experiments, this time focused on hypothermia. The stated goal was to find the best way to treat German pilots shot down over the frigid North Sea. To do this, Rascher and his team subjected around 300 prisoners to unimaginable suffering. Victims were forced into tanks of ice water for up to 3 hours as their bodies slowly froze. Their vital signs were meticulously recorded as they shivered violently, lost consciousness, and their hearts began to fail. In other cases, prisoners were stripped naked and left outside in the freezing winter for hours on end. Witnesses reported hearing their screams of agony as their bodies froze solid. But the horror didn't end there. The second phase was testing various rewarming techniques. Some victims were placed under sun lamps that caused severe burns. Others were thrown into vats of boiling water. In one of the most depraved methods, Rasher forced frozen prisoners between two naked women, who were also prisoners, to test rewarming by animal warmth. The vast majority of these people died. They died screaming in agony as the ice in their veins thawed, or their hearts simply gave out. Rasher, a favourite of SS leader Heinrich Himmler, documented every agonizing moment. These weren't medical procedures, they were slow, torturous executions disguised as science, where human life was utterly disposable. 2. Unit 731. Biological weapons tests, 1930s to 1940s. While Nazi atrocities are well documented, a parallel evil unfolded in Asia. In Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, known as Unit 731, committed some of the most heinous war crimes in history. Disguised as a water purification plant, the facility was actually a massive human experimentation center. The victims, mainly Chinese and Russian civilians and prisoners of war, were referred to as maruta, or logs, to dehumanize them. And they were treated with less regard than would. Led by General Shiro Ishii, the doctors of Unit 731 subjected at least 3,000 men, women, and children to unspeakable horrors. They were deliberately infected with diseases like the plague, anthrax, and cholera to study their effects. To study the disease's progression without the complication of decomposition, they would perform vivisections on conscious prisoners, often without anesthesia, removing organs while the victims were still alive. They tested weapons by tying prisoners to stakes and bombarding them with plague-infested fleas, shrapnel, and chemical agents. They tested the limits of human endurance by putting people in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out, or by deliberately freezing their limbs and then striking them to see if they were frozen solid. The scale of the horror is almost impossible to comprehend. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands more, were killed when these biological weapons were tested on Chinese cities. After the war, in a shocking act of cynical politics, the United States granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to the leaders of Unit 731, including Ishii, in exchange for their research data. As a result, many of the perpetrators completely escaped justice. 1. Nazi high-altitude experiments, 1942. At the very top of our list, we return to Dachau and the work of Dr. Sigmund Rascher. While his freezing experiments were monstrous, his high-altitude experiments represent a unique intersection of scientific precision and absolute barbarity. In 1942, to aid the German Air Force, Rascher set out to determine the limits of human survival at extreme altitudes. He used a portable low-pressure chamber to simulate the conditions a pilot would face ejecting without oxygen at heights up to 68,000 feet, more than twice the height of Mount Everest. Prisoners were locked inside as the pressure was rapidly lowered. What followed was a slow, torturous death. The victims convulsed, gasped for air, and suffered from the excruciating pressure changes that caused their lungs to hemorrhage and their blood vessels to burst. Rascher and his team watched impassively through a porthole, taking detailed notes on the prisoners' death throes. Some reports suggest that Rascher would sometimes perform live dissections on the brains of survivors to see how the low pressure had formed air bubbles in their blood vessels, believing this was the cause of death. Out of 200 people used in these experiments, 80 died outright inside the chamber. The other 120 were murdered afterward. This experiment stands as the ultimate perversion of the scientific method. It was a meticulously documented, controlled process designed for the sole purpose of watching human beings die in one of the most agonizing ways imaginable. It wasn't a quest to save lives, but a cold, calculated observation of death that stripped its victims of every last shred of dignity. Conclusion. From the psychological torment of the monster study to the industrial-scale butchery of Unit 731 and Auschwitz, these 10 experiments show the absolute worst of what humanity is capable of when the quest for knowledge is divorced from morality. They're chilling, they're horrifying, and they're a vital part of our history that must never be forgotten. The suffering of these victims was not entirely in vain. The revelation of the Nazi atrocities at the doctor's trial led directly to the creation of the Nuremberg Code in 1947. This landmark document established 10 principles for ethical human experimentation, the very first of which is that the voluntary, informed consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This principle, born from the ashes of unimaginable cruelty, is now the cornerstone of modern medical ethics, a permanent line drawn in the sand. These stories serve as a permanent, stark warning. Science must always serve humanity and never at its expense.